A week from today, voters in the United States will go to the polls to choose a new president. The result of that election matters most, of course, to 330 million Americans. But whoever ends up occupying the White House next January will also have a big impact on the rest of the world. To the extent that there's been any substantial debate between Donald Trump and his rival Kamala Harris in the campaign, it has focused mostly on domestic policy, immigration, taxation, and so on. Foreign policy is barely featured. Nevertheless, governments, investors, and companies around the world are trying to work out what the election will mean for them. A change of president could shift the outcome of conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. It might affect policy towards China. It could upend US economic policy, forcing trade partners and foreign investors to rethink their approach to the world's largest economy. So this week on The Big View, we're going to look into what the US presidential election means for the rest of the planet. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest stories in global business and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thal Larsen. To help us dig into this topic, I'm delighted to be joined by Tina Fordham. Tina's been analysing and advising clients on geopolitical risks for many years. She founded Eurasia Group's financial markets research business and worked as Citi's chief global political analyst before founding her own firm, Fordham Global Foresight, in 2022. In between, she also serves as a senior advisor in the UK Prime Minister's Strategy Unit and was appointed to the United Nations' first high-level panel on women's economic empowerment. And, newsflash, she's also just been named as one of the FN 100 Women in Finance for 2024. Tina's based in London, which is where I caught up with her recently. Tina Fordham, welcome to the Big View podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Tina, we're recording this a few weeks before the US presidential election, and I'm not going to ask you to try and forecast the results. But obviously, you talk to lots of people about how companies and financial institutions need to be prepared for different scenarios. That's sort of the world of political risk analysis these days. So what are the scenarios that your clients, and particularly those outside the United States, should be most focused on at the moment?
Well, Peter, there's what they are focused on and what I think they should be focused on, which are not necessarily the same thing. So in my work, I advise boards and the C-suite, mainly financial institutions, law firms, and insurers, but I also talk to lots and lots of institutional investors on a more kind of ad hoc basis. And I think the starting point is always, what's the conventional wisdom in markets? And as you say, we're a few weeks out, but the conventional wisdom in markets, despite the fact that it's a coin toss, this election, the polls have been very stable for over a month now. Investors believe that Trump is going to win, and US investors think that that's positive for markets. Non-US investors, whether that's us here in the UK and Europe or more broadly, are really concerned about a Trump 2.0. And so we have a lot of disconnects, I think, when we look at just the state of play in this election. If we look at the polls, Harris has a tiny lead, not statistically significant. If we look at the market view, they think it's 2016 again. And as one investor said to me privately, we don't want to miss the bonanza if it's Trump again. To me, that was one of the most telling quotes I heard, but that was a US venture capital investor who said that. And in Europe, I think it's kind of on the edge of our seats and hoping and praying. And I don't recall, and this is the fifth US election that I've covered professionally, I don't recall quite so much divergence between views as we see in this election. And that, to me, says political risk is going to be a feature in the outcome, almost no matter what it is.
Yeah, well, and obviously that's one of the issues, is that the range of outcomes, depending on the result, is so wide. But if we just think through the different scenarios, there's Trump winning, there's Harris winning.
There's also
Then
the
obviously
margin.
yeah,
There's the margin of winning, and that matters a lot. So most investors think, is it going to be the Democrat or the Republican? Let's do a side-by-side comparison of their policies and prepare for those kind of legal and regulatory scenarios. And that's where the usual playbook doesn't help us all that much here. Broadly speaking, Harris probably represents continuity, not just for business, but for kind of the US role in the world, US as an ally. And Trump represents change or volatility, however you want to frame it. But the scenario that I've really been trying to focus minds on in my work is of a disrupted or disputed outcome leading to an extended period, possibly months up until the inauguration, January 20th, of volatility, or something worse. And that is not just a tail risk, it's a material probability when you look at the state of play in the US.
yes, that's clearly one thing, and I know you've been talking about this for a while, that possibility. The other thing is which again people tend to focus less on, but is quite important, is what happens in Congress. How important do you think that will be?
Well, it's of huge importance. And so I remember talking to one head of trading at a European bank, for example. And I was, talking to him about these views, and he was pretty dismissive. And he said, "Listen, if Harris wins, it's higher taxes. If there's a divided Congress, then that'll keep her in check." And I suspect that probably represents the kind of mainstream view of most people in the markets. Now, for business leaders more generally, for corporates and for others, there's obviously more to the story. What kinds of bits of legislation or of the Biden agenda could hang on if Harris is president in a divided Congress? Probably things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which matters a lot for the green agenda, for the climate agenda. I was just talking to the UN Principles for a Responsible Investor crowd last week in Toronto about this. So, there'll be some changes that can withstand a divided Congress under a Harris presidency. But bearing in mind how US polls work and the whole kind of electoral college and down ballot phenomenon, if Trump is president and Republicans control both chambers of Congress, then we're looking at quite a wider range of scenarios and of change. I think it's going to be quite hard to really prepare for these divergent outcomes, to be frank.
Yes, well, and that's what creates the uncertainty. I mean, I suppose it might be helpful, given the range of possibilities, to perhaps focus in on some of the things that won't change, if there are any. I mean, you mentioned there the sort of the industrial policy, which it seems people think, well, it's tax breaks and subsidies that are creating jobs. They're going to want to hang on to that regardless of sort of who's in charge. Are there any other areas where you can see a consistency of approach regardless of who wins?
Well, I want to say at this point that I think there's much more disruption likely under a Trump White House than is being appreciated, just to start with. And apart from the business agenda, where investors are focused on the lower corporate tax rates, capital gains, and these kinds of things, which are hugely impactful, the domestic changes that Trump would bring could be potentially very, very disruptive. And I mean things like banning IVF, the possibility that 2 or 3 Supreme Court justices step down in order to allow President Trump to appoint new judges and keep the court conservative for another generation. These are things that wouldn't normally, kind of move the needle for investors, but because we're talking about the US, really bubble up into what business leaders have to think about in ways that are unusual. So that I now, when I talk to boards in the C-suite, it's not just about these matters of what used to be in government affairs, but rather personnel, the quest for talent, the idea that you might need to have 50 policies for working in the United States across red states and blue states, because more policies being kicked back to the states. So before we talk about the macro environment, I think we have to appreciate just the scale of change that's possible and the platform that President Trump is running on. I mean, he is talking about radical change. I think if the markets focus purely on the business-friendly bits, they could be in for some other surprises that could be impactful. But I guess what you mean, and to answer the question that you asked me, I think things like China policy, both Harris and Trump are going to continue in the vein of being tough on China. And President Trump said this in his debate with President Biden, the ill-fated debate that was the end of President Biden's pursuit for a second term. He said, "You kept my tariffs in place." And that's true. And it's important to bear in mind that President Trump imposed tariffs on China. And although Biden has had a different tenor and tone and is more focused on manufacturing, perhaps, although he's done a lot with chips, he hasn't rolled back. He hasn't been softer on China. And that's the kind of continuity, I suppose, that's likely. But I think Harris would probably go about it in a different way from her boss if she becomes president.
Yes, I think China is the one area that everybody says where there's sort of, the one thing in the US where there's bipartisan consensus on. So that's an area of continuity. I think I just want to come back to something you said about the sort of the consequences, the potential consequences domestically of a Trump presidency. And obviously that's a big issue if you're a big employer in the US. Lots of big foreign companies have big operations in the US, and they'll have to worry about that. One thing that comes up a bit in talking to investors and people who are looking after financial institutions outside the US is particularly the question of the Federal Reserve. Should we be worried if Trump is president about the independence of the Federal Reserve, the undermining of the independence of monetary policy, the potential effects on the US dollar or on the credibility of US debt? Is that something that should be more visible on people's radar screens?
Well, Peter, only if you think that the world's largest economy should have an independent central bank. And this is another area where the Trump campaign has been quite clear about their policies. I mean, going back again to that fateful debate, Trump stated he felt he should have a view on Federal Reserve policies. And since then, you might have seen the scoop from Barron's where they talked about the fact that they're planning on putting in something like a shadow chancellor, which is borrowing the idea from here in the UK. I mean, why can't you have a shadow chancellor? Although that's something that happens in opposition. I am surprised that this idea doesn't seem to be troubling anyone in markets as a political risk. But I think that's where Americans don't tend to appreciate what can happen when their independent institutions don't function the way they expect to. I don't know. I mean, I started my career as an EM expert, and I do look at my home country these days as an emerging markets. And I was writing that as far back as 2016. In preparation for our conversation, I actually, Peter, went back and read everything I'd written, all my op-eds for the last few years to try to see, as an exercise in humility, where I had gotten things wrong. With an EM framework, that kind of suggestion, if it was happening in Brazil, would really set the cat amongst the pigeons, but not so in the U.S. And is that because the dollar is a reserve currency, because the American investors have so much faith in institutions? I mean, I would really like to know. It's a question for me.
Is it? I mean, if I could, I think that's really interesting, but maybe I can sort of suggest one possible theory here isn't the conclusion from the first Trump administration that the institutions just about held up, right? So there was a lot of concern about this going in. But, the sort of separation of powers more or less worked. The Fed remained independent. The machinery of government kept going. And obviously it was pretty, touch and go at the end there on January the 6th, and so forth. But is it possible that people are sort of looking at this as saying, oh, we've seen this movie before, there's lots of anxiety, but actually at the end of the day, the US basically continues to function more or less the same as before?
Well, I think so, and so that's cognitive dissonance, and there's another example of it that I've seen from focus groups. Focus groups where they gather people from different constituencies to talk about issues, and I noticed something that some focus group work that was done with Latino voters talking about the mass deportation policy in Project 2025. On the face of it, according to these focus groups, Latino voters were not troubled by the idea of mass deportations until they were explained. It was explained that they could include that, that it would involve, apparently reactivating the laws that allowed Japanese American citizens to be interned during World War II, something that my dad has told me about. A lot of his school friends were part of this in California. So it's not engaging with the detail, whether it's central bank independence or mass deportations or curtailing reproductive freedom. And I think that's absolutely what's going on in part. And there's also clearly a nostalgia function at work. When people say my standard of living was better during the Trump presidency, well, that's because inflation was lower. It was before COVID and all kinds of other things.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking again about how this election matters to the rest of the world. I mean, probably the biggest difference between the two candidates is over Ukraine and Russia and the broader question of support for NATO. How do you see that playing out with different results?
Well, this is the number one topic of conversation that I have with my clients. It's about the U.S. role in the world, and particularly as it relates to European security. But I also talk to a lot of Asian and Middle Eastern institutions, being here in London as we are. And it's really important to appreciate that what happens next on Ukraine is not just of significance for Russia and what Russia does next. And old Russia experts like me are of the view that if Putin is allowed to keep hold of territory that he gained through the invasion of Ukraine, that it sends a signal not only that other former parts of the former Soviet Union may be at risk, but it also sends a signal to many other countries who are not happy with their current borders and would like to reacquire bits that they lost when empires fell and maps were redrawn. The Japanese are looking very carefully at what happens in Ukraine, and they understand, I think, quite thoroughly what signals will be sent. If the United States were to withdraw from NATO, or even something less dramatic like withhold funding, as happened with the United Nations during the Trump presidency, or other kinds of measures that would simply curtail U.S. participation in these global institutions, it would send a signal not only to U.S. allies who are part of the United States security umbrella, and that includes South Korea and Japan, Australia, and others, in addition to NATO. It also, in my view, is a green light to those actors who, as I say, are not happy with their current borders. Talk to Viktor Orban about what he thinks about Hungary's current borders.
Yeah, no, that has big consequences. You mentioned the Middle East to pick the other sort of big hotspot at the moment. And I know you've been talking for a while about the possibility of an escalation in that region, which we've seen recently with the Israeli attacks in Lebanon and Iran launching missiles against Israel. How How important is what happens in the US election, do you think, to what happens next in the Middle East?
Well, that's the extraordinary thing about 2024, is that, we knew it was going to be a year of elections, and we have these two hot conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and in the Middle East, both of which can become systemic, right? So yes, I'm not mentioning the terrible war in Sudan and other conflicts elsewhere in the world, and that's because we're focusing on what can happen to the global economy and markets, and both of these have triggered some volatility in commodities prices, and could get worse. When it comes to the Middle East, others have suggested that perhaps Benjamin Netanyahu is running down the clock between now and the U.S. elections in November, because he calculates that his position is likely to be strengthened by a return of Trump to the White House. We don't have the ability to read his mind, but there's some logic if that is indeed the case. You can see that Israel isn't really talking anymore about the hostages and has expanded its war aims in the conflict from beyond the Gaza Strip to the leadership of Hezbollah and some direct attacks from inside Iran. So yeah, as you say, I have been cautioning markets that the conflict would escalate. And so the pushback I get is, well, it's not causing higher oil prices, at least not until last week. And even so, from $72 a barrel for Brent for 78. But there's more to it, isn't there? I mean, a third channel, I believe, has opened up in kind of conflict risk from the Middle East, and that's to supply chains. So I think we've got to kind of reframe the way we think about the impact of the war, and also to remember that geopolitical risks are often most apparent in the second and third order effects.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you mentioned elections, and I suppose it'd be interesting to talk about this a little bit. We're sort of coming to the end of this year of elections. I mean, just to recap, Taiwan, Mexico, India, Indonesia, European Parliament, France, United Kingdom, Japan is squeezing one in right at the end, and obviously the US is the US presidential election is the big one. But at the beginning of the year, the consensus was that we were going to see this sort of rightward shift, particularly in Europe, right? Anti-immigration, anti-green, and so on. Sort of given from where we are now, how would you sort of take stock of what we've seen in terms of elections?
Yes, I mean there have been so many, and in so many different types of systems, that we really can't see a pattern emerge. I mean, it would be handy if there were one, but there really isn't. And so here in the UK, we've got a center-left government, and we're a massive outlier within Europe.
Mm.
The French elections, coming fast on the heels a couple of weeks later, and in the kind of the trail of the European parliamentary elections. On a smaller scale, if we want to focus on our home ground more in Europe, it's clear that not just right-wing parties, but extremist right-wing parties have really made gains in 2024. In the case of France, the two-round system, and strategic voting, tactical voting rather, was able to quash that. But if you look at Austria and regional elections in Germany, it's not just right-wing, it's extremist, it's neo-Nazi parties. And the European Parliament does have more representation from populist right parties. I don't think we have really even begun to digest what that really means. And I don't think investors feel very confident they have a grasp of what far-right parties want in a business sense. I mean, what does the alternative for Deutschland want? So I'm going to focus on the more, I think, unusual elections out of this lot. I also think we've got to talk about Venezuela, where there, by every type of estimate, the fragmented Venezuelan opposition was actually successful in mounting a candidate, a challenge to the post-Chavez government of Maduro. But we didn't hear much about it. And, the leaders having gone into exile. And you have to suspect that that's because of, perhaps lessons learned in trying to stand up, the U.S. and others trying to stand up to Maduro and not getting anywhere, kind of hollow promises. But again, the political scientist in me, wants to emphasize that there's a copycat effect that comes when it becomes normalized to say, well, we don't agree with that outcome, and we're not going to release the results. We're not going to agree to a recount. And the overall impact is not good for smooth political transitions and for democracy. And what is political risk in the first place? It's supposed to be about independent institutions and the kinds of policies which are beneficial for global business, not about gaming the system so that certain sectors are seen to benefit.
Yes, that's a very good point. That sort of stability is really what people are looking for, and which is so lacking.
What they used to want, it's what they used to talk about, but now it appears we're happy for systems to be co-opted as long as we think we're on the
getting
inside.
the right outcome. Yeah. Well, I just want to come back to something you mentioned earlier, which is this question of the unpredictability of U.S. policy, U.S. foreign policy, in particular. It's gone from Obama to Trump to Biden, now possibly back to Trump again. If you just take one example, climate policy. Obama signed the Paris Agreement. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. Biden went back in. Presumably Trump would come back out again if he wins again. I mean, we can talk here about sort of what different results of the election might mean for the next 4 years. But given that the US is so polarized, given that the elections are so close, is there a sense here that anybody who's trying to do sort of longer term planning is just working on the assumption that the US is going to be less reliable in the future? Has that ship already sailed to a certain extent?
I don't think it has, and I'll tell you why. When we look at the kind of regional growth outlook around the world, a few things stand out, don't they? And one is that the United States, for all of its problems, is outperforming the rest of the world. And so, we're flagging a China slowdown as one of our, or the China slowdown as one of the biggest risks for 2025, aided by the difficulties in the property sector. Europe is anemic. We in the UK are even worse. Where is there growth and relative political stability if you are a corporate chasing growth and looking for alpha? It's the United States. So I think that is actually a lot of the source of giving the U.S. a pass on its inconsistencies.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But you think that extends to sort of governments and institutions and companies outside the US as well?
Oh, definitely, because it's the market that that I end up talking about the most, how to expand their presence in the US, despite what is for non-American business leaders a fairly bewildering political climate. And we mentioned the climate discussion. It's just worth stating clearly that the Conservative Party in the UK was still to the left of the Democrats when it comes to issues like climate change. I mean, you have a significant proportion of people, including business leaders in the United States, who don't think climate change is real.
I think, well, you used the word bewildering, and I think that's a really good note on which to end. I think it will continue to be bewildering. It will continue to be fascinating. There will be a lot to talk about and think about and write about in the coming weeks. And I'm sure, Tina, we will return to all of these topics at some point in the future. But for now, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and for giving us the benefits of your insights and your long experience of looking at these questions.
Thank you for having me, Peter. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for tuning in. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favorite platform. Don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as other great podcasts from the Reuters team. If you like what you hear, please follow The Big View and let us know what you think. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and reuters.com.